Greetings from Oxford. I am Roger Griffin. I'm a retired professor from Oxford Brookes University, and in a week's time I hope we'll be discussing the contents and the theory introduced in the following slideshow. Now, I have to explain a little bit about the nature of this PowerPoint. That it's full of words and is far too long to read out or present slide by slide. What I intend to do instead is use my commentary, my voiceover, to introduce you to the reading of the slideshow. So this is a slideshow to read and look at, and I'm going to try and use the possibility of putting on an audio commentary to guide you to what you'll be encountering. There's far too much material here to be presented simply in a talk, which is why Anton Chekhov and I decided that it would be better to circulate the PowerPoint before the session we're going to have together, rather than try to cover it actually in the time for discussion. So I am attempting here to add something to an understanding of Putin's political strategies. I think it says somewhere in the Bible that God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. Well, I think Putin's movements are less wonderful and more scary and far more sinister, but he certainly moves in mysterious ways. And I am attempting to use some of the insights I have drawn from my extensive work on fascism and the psychology of fascism and the sociodynamics which make fascism popular at certain points in history, to try to understand Putin's motivation and the resonance which his politics, or so-called style of politics, has with some segments of the Russian population. I am doing this certainly not as a Russianist, an expert on Russia, a Russia watcher, or an expert on Putin. This is way outside my comfort zone, but I'm hoping that some of the ideas I introduce will stimulate a useful discussion. Just to set the tone of history of ideas and speculation that is characteristic of this presentation, I have included a statement by the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu from The Art of War, which I think resonates somewhat with the strategies of Putin. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. I'm sure there would be an enigmatic smile on Putin's lips when he reads a statement like that. Now, I'm recording this on Sunday, the 25th of April, after a number of days when Putin's politics have been very much in the news. Of course, there's the steady build-up of troops on the Ukrainian border, referred to on the left there on the front page of The Economist. There's been the scandal about the alleged blowing up of an arms dump in the Czech Republic, which may well have involved the two agents who also carried out a poisoning in Salisbury. Navalny has just given up his hunger strike, and who knows how all that is going to pan out. And of course, within the few days between this talk and my recording this talk and when we will discuss, who knows what else will have happened. Now, I have no intention of working through the next few slides because I've tried as an outsider to summarize some of the main assaults on democratic processes, both at home and abroad, and I'm sure some of these may be rephrased by you and added to or subtracted, but it builds up a picture of a politician who is certainly not playing according to the ground rules of Western democracy and the international community as laid down by the United Nations or NATO or international agreements. So I've tried to look at the various aspects of his attempts to subvert democracy, covert actions against Western democracies, examples of disinformation and cyber warfare. And here I refer to just a few instances of the Russian state's involvement in war crimes or state murders committed in secret, which are presumably a tip of a rather large iceberg of state-sponsored inhumanity. These are just some of the things we know about. And obviously this extraordinary behavior by a head of a nation state with ostensibly a democratic system of accountability, somebody who takes part in international conferences and negotiations, etc., has attracted the attention of cartoonists and satirists, and I'm interested in how these try to capture the core of Putin's particular style, if we can call it a style, of politics. What I find striking is the number of satirists and cartoonists who picked up on a fundamental principle of Putin's politics, which is to disseminate chaos, to instigate subversive tactics in secret, in a sort of covert war against democratic procedures. Here we obviously see him ensconced in power in his equivalent of the White House, in the context of America and Trump, but obviously the principle above his head with this rather perplexed American eagle reacting to the chaos that Putin is causing is really symptomatic of a much more generalized approach to foreign policy in general. Here we have I think a very neat, again it's American-centered, but it is the war against American democracy is symptomatic of a much wider policy, and here we have Putin actually, as it were, being at the hub of a cyber war on America. Again, America is the target here, but I like the list of principles of subversion which are along the wall: fear, panic, turmoil, division, mistrust, chaos, and hate, and the various symbols of social media there. And again, we have this image of him as a sort of Machiavellian Trump, made Russia great again, sort of, and we have references again to the cyber war on the left and the military involvement in Syria on the right. So nothing I'm saying today is particularly new in the way I'm characterizing or caricaturing Putin, but what I do hope to cast some light on is the way of approaching him as representing a particular psychological principle, which I will come on to later. Now, where cartoonists and satirists use images and humour, political scientists try to use concepts to capture the fundamental novelty or essence of a form of politics. And Putin has generated a whole series of different uses of established terms. Here I'm heavily dependent on Anton Chekhov's excellent article, Conceptualizing Malign Influence of Putin's Russia in Europe. And he gives a very helpful glossary of terms and with short definitions such as soft coercion, sharp power, dark power, maskirovka, political war. We have hybrid war, information warfare, disruptive and destructive public diplomacy strategies, and Anton's preferred or suggested addition to this list, malign or malicious influence, influence that directly or indirectly subverts and undermines European values and democratic institutions. Now, rather pedantically, I'd like to point out an interesting aspect of the word malign. I mean, obviously it's the opposite of benign, and it comes from the Latin mal, malus, meaning bad, rather than ben, meaning good. But there's an interesting fact in French that there is a direct link between maligne, which is the French for malign, and malin. Now, malin is an interesting word. It's a colloquial word, and it's used extensively for anything which is cunning, underhand, deceptive, furtive, malicious, malevolent. And I do like the fact that the word malign is linked to the whole idea of an underhand, covert war or set of tactics which uses subterfuge, which uses deception and illusionism to, or cheating, straightforward cheating, and unfair tactics in order to achieve a goal and to win some sort of struggle. I'm also interested in the fact historically that the word mischief, which in English means doing things, it's quite an innocent word in a way. I mean, he did it out of mischief, but historically mischief could be something much bigger, a sort of breakdown of order and rationality, and something quite evil. It's something that the devil wants to create in the world is mischief, and it actually comes from the negative of the stem of achieve. So to achieve something, which ultimately comes from the Latin stem cap, meaning head, to actually come to the head of something. Mischief is an underhand way of achieving something. It's an evil, negative form of achievement, and implies that you realize your ambitions, but in a corrupt, devious, underhand, and illegal way. So just a bit of language there, all of which shows just how difficult it is to use language in a way against the current of democratic thinking. I mean, we have a very sophisticated set of terms to talk about openly undemocratic systems, dictatorship and totalitarianism, etc. But Putin is difficult to capture because it's a bit like that fairground game where you have a mechanism that tries to pick up soft toys, and it tries to grab them with these claws, but the claws are too weak to actually pick up the soft toy. And Putin is like a not very soft toy that our conceptual grab never quite succeeds in getting hold of. Interestingly, the word concept comes from the Latin for to grab hold of or to take hold of. So in a way, what I'm trying to do in this talk today, and more specifically in the set of slides, which I do hope you will be able to read through by turning off the narrative in PowerPoint, just turn it off, and then it is liberated from my voice and my commentary. is just add to the conceptual framework that we can use when we try to characterize him. Now, one approach which was not mentioned by Anton in his excellent article is a very well-established concept in Western political theory, which is the idea of Machiavellian politics, the idea that a politician is cunning when he has to be and plays it straight when he can, but his straightness is never really straight because underneath the mindset is crooked, the mindset is pragmatic. And this idea of playing the game like a poker game, where if you have a good hand, you play it, but if you don't have a good hand, you then use deception and simulation and dissimulation, etc., in order to win the game against a better hand, is absolutely central to some of the key passages of The Prince. And so we get here, I think, a rather classic statement. A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, that is, the beast within, ought to choose the fox and the lion. These are the avatars. These are the if you like, the mythical creatures or the familiars that the good politician must cultivate inside him or herself, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Snares are sort of traps laid by human beings to trap a creature. They're normally hidden in the grass or the leaves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares and a lion to terrify the wolves. Those who rely simply on the lion do not understand what they are about. Therefore, a wise lord cannot, nor ought he to, keep faith when such observance may be turned against him, and when the reasons that caused him to pledge it exist no longer. In other words, he's telling the prince that if there are circumstances when he has to lie or break his word or break his bond or not fulfill a contractual agreement, then he should do that without any sense of guilt or bad conscience, because it's pure pragmatism to do that. In any case, the others would behave exactly the same in the same situation. And he comes out with this, I think, rather fascinating statement. If men were entirely good, this precept would not hold, but because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to observe it with them. He who has known best how to employ the fox has succeeded best, but it is necessary to know well how to disguise this characteristic and to be a great pretender and dissembler. And men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. So you have to systematically assume that other people are not good. So you therefore would be stupid and naive to be good all the time and to keep your word and to be open and to lay your cards on the table without having other cards up your sleeve. But however, you have to disguise your deviousness. You have to disguise your actual intentions and tactics. You have to be a great pretender and dissembler. Now here is a picture of Niccolò Machiavelli, and I find it interesting that a journalist has picked up on this link with Putin. There's the reference, who says that there are another 11 principles that Putin has not yet applied. But this raises the question, should we really see Putin as Machiavellian? Because Machiavelli was reflecting an age which was not yet democratic. He was operating in an age, he was reflecting on a society and a political situation where, if you like, everybody was a Putin and if they weren't a Putin, they were really stupid and they would lose their power. If you look at the politics in early modern Italy, not to mention the papacy and other countries, you look at the court of Henry VIII or whatever, they were all at it. In other words, Putin, if he is Machiavellian, is behaving outside his time. The central character of a play written in 1612 called The White Devil focuses on the Machiavellian machinations of a group of ambitious men, essentially Francisco de Medici, who uses treachery, subterfuge, covert violence and devious methods rather than open confrontation with his enemies to achieve his ends. And this is absolutely typical of late Renaissance society. But Putin's Russia operates in a modern international arena where, after the collapse of the USSR, at least in principle, it could have adopted rational Enlightenment, democratic, if you like, Western principles and participated in transparent global institutions based on universal humanistic values as formulated by the UN. Can I just add, of course, that I'm not suggesting at all that the West is not corrupt and is not full of examples of flagrant breaches with universal humanistic principles of democracy and human rights. I mean, that's obviously not what I'm suggesting at all. But relative to Putin's Russia, I would suggest it is less corrupt and closer in attempts to apply global rules of rational humanistic behavior. So if Putin's out of his time by behaving like a member of the Medici family, we need to probe further into psychology behind his perpetuation of the KGB's covert operations and dirty tricks. What drives Putin's constant recourse to underhand, devious, illusionist, covertly criminal tactics, sometimes involving murder and mass crimes against humanity, to undermine the West and silence alleged enemies of Russia at home and abroad? So I'm going to follow the thread, the verbal thread of the word resentment. I'm going to try to see where it gets us when we start looking through the lens of resentment at Putin's politics. And what I'm going to suggest is that there is a subterranean link between what Anton calls malign influence, which you get in asymmetric power relationships, and resentment. Now, asymmetric power relationships, I would argue, give rise to a sense of humiliation and inferiority. And if that sense of humiliation and inferiority is linked to some sort of major traumatic event in a nation's history or an individual's history, then it can actually produce a pathological form of resentment and a thirst for vengeance, which will express itself not directly in a sort of open test of power and authority, as between two, for example, animals who are fighting for, or mammals who are fighting for ascendancy in a tribe or a clan of animals, but rather a covert attempt to pull an enemy down. I'm reminded of the way hyenas, a pack of hyenas, can dispense with a large animal by acting as a pack. There's some very good and disturbing footage about that in nature documentaries. Now, if we want to be a bit more specific, I'm bringing in two examples in literature or in fiction of case studies of a situation where a sense of humiliation and and being subordinated to somebody else has created a sense of jealousy and resentment, and which leads to the application of Machiavellian tactics. First of all, famously Shakespeare's Iago, which, according to a critical source, centers on a Machiavellian schemer and manipulator whose resentment stems from his conviction that he has been unfairly passed over for promotion to the rank of Othello's lieutenant in favor of Michael Cassio. Iago plots to manipulate Othello into demoting Cassio and thereafter to bring down the downfall of Othello himself. And the whole play is a case study in the link between resentment and the exerting of malign influence on Othello himself and his basis of power, bringing him down from his perceived heights, by Iago, who, as it were, feels driven to apply unfair tactics because of his sense of being passed over and put into second place. A much more recent example, and psychologically I would argue even more complex, is The Joker, which studies how Arthur Fleck, now Fleck in German just means a stain or smudge on a piece of clothing, something you want to get rid of. I don't know if that's intentional. How Arthur Fleck, a lonely, fragile, but initially compassionate individual, suffers bullying, marginalization, public humiliation and ridicule and unfair dismissal from his job in circumstances of acute social deprivation and cruelty. The consequent identity crisis and mounting paranoia lead him to forge a sociopathic alter ego prepared to use deception, disguise, deviousness and random acts of murderous violence to enact his mounting hatred of those who fit, who belong in society, which by the end triggers a wave of nihilistic rioting against the system. There's this quite extraordinary sense by the end of the film that his own personal, private resentment and war against society has somehow lit a fuse or set fire to the tinder which will give rise to social unrest and chaos. Of course, the film is a prequel of the Batman series, and what I find interesting is that whoever wrote it highlights the link between socially inflicted trauma and resentment and the evolution of the Joker avatar, who will go on to be so devious, sadistic, malignant and nihilistically destructive in his private war against the good of Batman and Gotham in the film franchise, driven by his hatred of Batman and his desire to unleash total chaos. So I'm suggesting that the film actually explores through fiction the link between resentment, asymmetrical power relationship with the cause of the resentment, or the imagined cause of the resentment, and the idea of a vendetta against society. The Joker's final personality of socio-pathological prankster, Joker, evil clown, corresponds to the dark shadow aspect of the Jungian archetype of the jester as a fool, a trickster, a prankster, a practical joker. So what comes through very clearly is the idea that the Joker is a sort of evil double of the happy, light, life-asserting aspect of the clown or the jester, and therefore tips the idea of a comic personage into the realm of horror, of a horror film. And here are just a couple of images. That's the image at the top of Iago and Othello. And I find it quite interesting that somebody has made a link between the Joker there holding up the Joker card and the cartoonist who has created a photo montage of Putin as an incarnation of the evil clown and the Joker attempting to take over the world. Note the reference at the bottom to not fake news but freaking news. Even fake news, which is a pathological concept in the mind of Trump, can be turned into and disarmed through satire. All of which leads us on, logically, at least in my mind, to Nietzsche's concept of resentment, or rather Ressentiment, in the genealogy of morals, where Nietzsche is exploring the basis for a solution to the nihilism of the modern world, which he thinks will be released and unleashed by the growing realization of the absence of any higher divine principle in the world, or what he calls the death of God. There is a passage where he, the philosopher, contrasts those who embody the master morality of the higher self, or if you like, it's called Übermensch, mistranslated Superman, or not mistranslated, but given the comic and film franchise, really an unusable concept now, especially after what the Nazis did with it. But I think originally the Übermensch is a reference to the higher self or higher human being. Mensch is not a male principle in German. This higher self lives out the will to power uninhibited by weak ethical considerations based on a fictitious afterlife, what Nietzsche calls a world behind the world, a Hinterwelt. And the contrast to those who live out uninhibitedly their benign will to live, will to power, not in the evil Nazi sense, but in a Nietzschean sense of a celebration of life, of Lebensbejahung, of affirming life. Those who live out their higher principle in a vitalistic way are contrasted by Nietzsche with what he calls slave morality, the slave morality of those who suffer oppression at the hands of the master race of spiritual elite, not Nazi Aryan elite, and are impotent to challenge or confront them openly. Now, those who are trapped in slave morality and who cling on to the idea of an afterlife to justify their meekness and their subordinate position resent the embodiments of the higher morality. To overcome a sense of inferiority, worthlessness and nihilism, they invert the mythic categories of good and bad, higher and lower, and seek vengeance by developing an obsession with acts of vendetta and retribution that subvert the spiritual confidence, creativity, freedom and joie de vivre of the masters, and attempt to destroy their hegemony and their self-belief and their higher self. Tries to pull them down off their high horse. The hallmark of those driven by slave morality in their grudge war against those who feel they belong to a higher category of humanity is a, quote, persistent, corrosive, emotional pattern of resentful hatred against their enemies, which Nietzsche calls ressentiment. Now, as the son of a pastor and steeped in Christianity, who became a secular philosopher, profoundly interested in the history of ideas, he obviously seeks to explain the mystery, as far as he is concerned, of Judeo-Christianity's deferral of heaven to some mythical afterlife, and why it has conducted a war on vitalism, sensual enjoyment, and the benign embrace of the will to power. Why is it such an anomaly in the history of cultures, all of which, apart from Judeo-Christianity, seem to celebrate a sense of power and vitality and vitalism in this life. And he attributes it to the Jews' need to find existential justification for and dignity and value, and if you like, a source of superiority in their status as slaves of the Egyptians, and then in their plural diasporas, where they were driven out of their homeland, and in their subsequent subjugation by the Romans. And that he suggests that they achieved this sense of compensation for their subjugation and their humiliation through the myth of a Jewish Messiah, and a Jewish Messiah which will be the sign of being a people chosen by God, and who have unique access to divine truth and to salvation in an afterlife. That is, if you like, the vengeance of the Jews on cultures based on the will to power and on the Übermensch, on the higher self. And of course, Christians then reinforce this tradition by seeing a similar sort of vindication of withdrawal from life and the suppression of vitalistic emotions in the explicit inversion of master-slave values in the Sermon on the Mount, which is so brilliantly parodied in Monty Python's Life of Brian. And in the Sermon on the Mount, it is explicitly stated in the words of Jesus that the mighty will be humiliated and the meek will inherit the earth. So here we have, in Nietzschean terms, the core of resentment and resentment politics, that it is the attempt to turn the fact of subordination and humiliation and trauma into a virtue, into a sign of superiority. Ressentiment is thus born of an asymmetrical power relation, where the weaker party, inwardly convinced of its superiority to those who are now in power or who have achieved hegemony, and nostalgic for former power and glory, are unable to fight back openly to overthrow their alleged oppressors. The path of open conflict and confrontation is closed to them by their status, by their subordination, by their weakness. They thus develop tactics of subversion. And if you want a historical example of that, under the Romans, there was formed a Jewish terrorist movement, the Sicari, the dagger carriers, and who to fight the Roman occupation using subversive terrorist tactics. And of course, the early Christianity was made up of a clandestine movement to overthrow the Romans. So the subversive tactics are a feature of groups in a position of weakness. And following a similar pattern, a weaker power can develop a far-reaching campaign to discredit the hegemonic societal power that oppresses it and replace it with their own vision of the world, which condemns the dominant one as evil or immoral. This is what happened under Christianity, but equivalence of it can occur when a political power feels hurt, humiliated, slighted, put down by other powers, who are then portrayed as in their turn evil and immoral. Now, the historical example of this in practice is when, under Constantine the Great in the 4th century, Christianity was installed as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, which sort of fulfilled its suppressed longing for hegemony. This event, incidentally, was seen as the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. Once the Roman Empire had, as it were, internalized the Christian morality, or what Nietzsche calls the slave morality, Edward Gibbon, in his famous historical investigation, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, actually, as far as he is concerned, the embrace of Christianity marked the ultimate victory of slave morality. And here is the cover of the Genealogy of Morals, which explores the concept of ressentiment. So I want to add to the conceptual armory of those trying to make sense of Putin's politics with this term resentment politics. I mean, I think it's too much of a mouthful to keep using the French, but the way I'm using the word resentment here, as it were, subsumes Nietzschean ideas of ressentiment as the expression of slave morality, or the ethics and the behavior of those who feel in an asymmetrical power situation and not able to resort to overt power conflict. So resentment politics refers to a political mindset and resulting strategy that depends for its effectiveness on the covert actions of agencies officially or unofficially operating on behalf of a non-democratic state, or of extremist movements working independently of an established state, but carried out in the name of a threatened religious culture. Their purpose is to create mischief, anxiety or fear, which will undermine the sense of entitlement, hegemony, invulnerability, and existential security of a legitimate regime, or temporarily interrupt and disable the smooth, democratic, administrative or technological functioning of a perceived enemy state, culture or society. Precluded from deploying the means for conventional interstate confrontation or warfare, the state or extremist movement of the aggrieved society thus resorts to deviousness, subterfuge, dirty tricks, or random terroristic attacks against semiotically significant targets in order to inflict material damage and, probably more importantly, psychological wounds on the perceived enemy. In doing so, it wreaks symbolic vengeance on the superior nation or culture for, which is how they see it, for harm allegedly inflicted, reasserts the heroism of the mythic golden age or former power of the nation or culture of the dispossessed, and demonstrates the unbroken resolve, spirit, national and communal strength, and essential superiority of the weaker society. I invite you to mull over that long-winded definition. Of that rather long-winded definition, incidentally, the reference to religious culture will be explained later when I refer fleetingly to ISIS as an example of resentment politics in action in another historical context. Now, this rather abstract and conceptual political scientific attitude to the explanation of Putin, I think, needs to be brought alive a little bit, and I use as a way of illustrating the psychological and almost socio-pathological dynamics of it, with reference to this extraordinary film, Fight Club. Of course, it started off as a novel, which I would argue illustrates the dynamics of resentment and the way it can lead to an attempt to wreck the surrounding society in a sort of rebellion of the resentful. In the film, and obviously also in the novel, we can see how the mainspring of the attacks on society, which are one of the themes of the book, is expressed in a passage, a crucial passage relating to the foundation of the Fight Club. I'm not going to bore you with a summary. You can look it up if you haven't seen it. I would recommend you to see the film if you haven't seen it. Man, I see in Fight Club the strongest and smartest men who've ever lived. I see all this potential, and I see squandering. God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars, advertising, and we're slowly learning that fact. Greed is institutionalized. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate, so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact, and we're very, very pissed off. And a direct link is made in the book and the film between that sense of anomie, of being a lost generation without a real cause, of being conned and deceived by a society which presents itself as powerful and meaningful, but which is actually empty and hollow, and the violence of the Project Mayhem, which is launched by the alter ego of the main character, the founder of Project Mayhem. We have front rows for this theatre of mass destruction. The demolition committee of Project Mayhem wrapped the foundation columns of a dozen buildings with blasting gelatine. In 2 minutes, primary charges will blow base charges, and a few square blocks will be reduced to smouldering rubble. I believe the plan is to blow up the headquarters of these credit card companies and the TRW building. If you erase the debt record, then we all go back to zero. It'll create total chaos. So there is a direct link made in the novel between the resentment of a lost generation and a war on society. The symbolic blowing up of buildings, of skyscrapers, this is before 9/11, which are associated with the rule of this empty God, this meaningless monolith of capitalism. Now, I've already talked for over 46 minutes, so I'm going to really just announce what the rest of the talk was about, because I hope that you will actually just read it through as a sort of essay on slides. So on this slide, I basically just refer to two ways of reading the film in terms of Nietzschean categories. And then I dwell, and here I am out of my comfort zone, on the sources of Putin's resentment of the West. And it's speculative, this. I'm sure the experts reading these slides will have things to criticize or add to it. But I also suggest that Putin's resonance with his followers in Russia, which may be fading now, is because he was able to articulate and turn into a weapon against the West the resentment of a lot of ordinary Russians about the sudden collapse of their world status as a world power, which they had in the Cold War. And I try to document that with the with websites and journalism and books which talk about the resentment factor in Russian politics. I locate this resentment in the context of a national identity crisis that encouraged popular support for Putin's Project Mayhem against the West. And I continue this with some more reflections on the popular resonance of Putinism as a defiant stand against the West and against Europe and America in particular, which plugs into a very important component of Russian consciousness from what I gather, which is the sense of a unique Russian Eurasian identity. So it links in with Eurasianism. And I then suggest that Russia's anti-democratic hyper-nationalism, or at least the Putin version of it, is a compensatory myth for the failure to build a successful democracy and powerful, respected Russia on the same terms as that of Western democracies. And then, in order to bring in a bit of self-criticism, which I know is originally a sort of socialist concept or communist concept, I do point out the fact that the attempt to link Putin to a body of feeling within Russia is a methodological gamble, because it assumes some sort of link between a leader and the people, and that is obviously quite a complicated concept. There are all sorts of myths about the body politic or the nation or community of believers as a body, and what I don't want to do is assume that there is really is a organic entity called the Russians. I'm aware of the fact that actually Russia is an extremely complicated and complex society, and that there is a very great body of opinion either suspicious of Putin or actively opposed to it. So I am aware of the fact that there's a danger of generalization, but I still think that history shows that there are moments when there is a sort of resonance between the fanaticism of a leader and a significant component of the nation, and you can see this, for example, in the case of Nazism and fascism. Here are a few illustrations of the concept of some sort of organic body, which I think is a slightly misleading myth, but it has some relevance to understanding mass movements and national behavior. And I continue by talking about methodological issues raised by attempting to look at collective behavior in terms of psychoanalytical categories or just psychological categories, such as resentment and vengeance, which I agree are methodologically complicated. And certainly when we start talking about a national character or a national personality, we've got to be extremely careful. But having drawn attention myself to the methodological problems of my own theory, I just want to end with a reference to possible cases where the idea of resentment politics could be usefully applied outside the context of Russia. For example, in North Korea, in the rise of right-wing populism as a form of resentment politics, and possibly most fruitfully in the context of Islamism, which I think rather neatly fits my approach to Putinism. Once you see the link between Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban in terms of the humiliation of a once powerful, dominant, religious, technological, civilized culture, and the sense of resentment of the West as a false god, in a way, which is undermining the coherence of Islam. I end on a slightly optimistic note from the point of view of anti-Putinism, at least, which is that the application of resentment politics as the basis of stable power in any historical context is, of course, extremely vulnerable, because once the resentment passes, or once the politician who embodies that resentment passes, as inevitably Putin one day will, it provides a big problem of continuity and succession. This is one of the big problems that was never faced by the charismatic political system of fascism, both in the case of Mussolini and Hitler. This was the great Achilles heel of fascism. How do you perpetuate charismatic leadership and resentment politics as the basis of future government? It was a problem brilliantly solved by both communism and the Catholic Church in terms of of assuring the succession of leadership. So that is one reflection. I'd like to leave you with this image of Putin as the bearer of many faces, which I have taken from the Guardian newspaper in Britain, and reflect on the fact that obviously Putin, and this is not unique to Putin, of course, it's true of all leaders, I would have thought, shows the world many faces with many personalities. I think the idea that there is a true, authentic Putin is itself rather psychologically suspect, but I would suggest that there is a big gap between the faces that he shows the world and his inner personality and his inner motivation. And I hope that despite its vulnerability to lots of specialist criticism, that my theory of resentment politics and the idea of Putin's covert war and Machiavellian behavior in his dealings both with his own nation and with the West is illuminated by the notion of resentment and resentment politics, and that nevertheless I have contributed something in terms of concepts to resolving the enigma of Putinism, and I thoroughly look forward to being corrected and helped on my way to deeper understanding by the discussion that we will have together, thanks to the powers of Zoom, which will probably be monitored by some Russian agency, and I would love to engage with whatever agency is monitoring this as well. So on that paranoid note, I leave you and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much indeed for all the time you have put into taking this on board. Till next week.